10 miles off the coast of Louisiana, at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, oil has been rising to the surface almost every single day for more than 2 decades. For years, nobody outside a small circle of engineers and regulators knew exactly why. There was no leaking tanker, no blown-out wellhead visible from the surface, no obvious source at all, just a persistent, mysterious slick that kept reappearing no matter how many times cleanup crews skimmed it away. Have you ever really wondered how an entire oil platform, standing taller than a 40-story building, could simply vanish overnight into the seabed and take almost 20 long years for anyone to fully understand what actually happened to it? This is the story of the Taylor Energy platform, a billion-dollar disaster that started with a single hurricane and never actually ended. To understand how something this size could disappear, you first have to understand what stood there before it did. In the late 1970s and through the following decades, the Gulf of Mexico became one of the most valuable stretches of ocean on the planet. Beneath its muddy floor sat billions of barrels of crude oil, and the companies that could reach it stood to make fortunes. Taylor Energy, founded by Patrick F. Taylor in 1979, became one of the largest privately owned oil and gas companies operating in the Gulf, and by the early 2000s it had built a production platform designed to tap into that wealth directly. It was called Mississippi Canyon 20, known within the industry simply as the Saratoga. This wasn't an isolated venture either. By the early 2000s, the Gulf of Mexico had become dotted with thousands of platforms, from small single-well structures to enormous production hubs supporting entire regional economies onshore. Louisiana ports built their livelihoods around servicing these rigs, and companies like Taylor Energy competed fiercely for drilling leases in deeper and more remote sections of the Gulf floor, chasing reserves that older, shallow-water platforms had already exhausted. The deeper the water, the higher the stakes, and the more a single structural failure could cost. Insurance for these platforms was priced accordingly, built around decades of hurricane data, engineering models, and an industry-wide assumption that even the worst storms would primarily threaten what stood above the waterline, not what lay hidden in the sediment far below it. The Saratoga wasn't just another platform bolted to the seafloor. It stood over 450 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, including its pedestal, with its legs anchored deep into the ocean floor roughly 10 miles from the mouth of the Mississippi River. From that single structure, Taylor Energy drew oil from 28 separate wells, all connected through a dense web of pipes, risers, and wellheads running down into the seabed. In an industry built on scale, the Saratoga represented exactly the kind of investment that defined success. Enormous upfront cost, enormous long-term output, and enormous confidence that the structure holding it all together would simply endure. To picture the Saratoga properly, imagine a steel tower the height of a 40-story office building, except instead of sitting on solid ground, its legs are driven into soft, shifting seabed hundreds of feet below the waves, supporting not just its own weight, but the weight of drilling equipment, crew quarters, storage tanks, and a tangle of pipework carrying pressurized crude oil upward around the clock. That confidence wasn't unreasonable. Offshore platforms across the Gulf were engineered to survive hurricanes, and by 2004 the industry had decades of storm data to build against. What nobody had fully accounted for was what could happen not from the wind and waves above the surface, but from what a hurricane could do to the seafloor itself. On September 15, 2004, Hurricane Ivan made landfall as a powerful Category 3 storm, one of the most destructive hurricanes to hit the Gulf Coast that decade. As it passed near the Saratoga's location, its enormous wave energy didn't just batter the platform from above, it triggered something far more dangerous underwater, a massive underwater mudslide. Imagine an avalanche, except instead of snow crashing down a mountainside, it's millions of tons of seafloor sediment sliding sideways along the bottom of the ocean, dragging everything anchored to it along for the ride. The force was enough to snap the platform's support legs entirely. The Saratoga, a structure the height of a skyscraper, toppled over and was buried beneath the churning mud, along with the network of wells and pipes that had once fed oil up to the surface. Underwater mudslides of this scale are notoriously difficult to predict, precisely because they don't behave like anything engineers can easily model on land. Loose sediment that has been building up on a continental slope for centuries can sit in a fragile equilibrium for decades until the right combination of wave pressure and seismic-like shock from a passing storm suddenly liquefies it. In an instant, ground that had supported a fixed structure for years simply stops behaving like ground at all and starts flowing like a dense, heavy fluid. Whatever happens to be anchored into it, whether that's a pipeline, a platform leg, or an entire drilling complex, gets carried along in the current with almost no warning. By the time the storm cleared and engineers could assess the damage, there was nothing left standing to inspect. The platform itself was gone, pulled roughly 500 feet from its original position and buried under what would eventually be measured at around 150 feet of mud and sediment. 28 wells, each one a direct pipeline into a high-pressure reservoir of crude oil, now sat crushed and scattered somewhere beneath that sediment, completely inaccessible using any of the equipment or techniques the industry had ever needed before. Taylor Energy did attempt a response. Divers and remote vehicles were sent down to locate and seal off the wells one by one, an operation that ultimately cost the company more than $13 million. Slowly, engineers managed to successfully plug 25 of the 28 wells buried in the debris field, but the final handful proved impossible to reach safely. The mud was too deep, the wreckage too unstable, and the risk of triggering an uncontrolled blowout by disturbing the wrong section of pipe too high. Eventually, the company quietly stopped trying. The remaining wells were left exactly where the mudslide had buried them, still connected to a reservoir of oil under enormous natural pressure, still slowly finding their way to the surface through cracks and channels in the sediment above. For years, this barely registered as a public story at all. A persistent sheen would occasionally appear on the water's surface near the old platform site, but without an obvious source, without a visible rig or a dramatic blowout, it simply wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines. Local fishermen who noticed the recurring sheen sometimes assumed it was simply a natural seep, since the Gulf of Mexico has always had pockets of crude oil bubbling up from cracks in the seafloor on its own, a phenomenon that predates offshore drilling entirely. Others suspected it might be linked to one of the many other platforms dotting the area, since pinpointing an exact source from the surface alone was nearly impossible without specialized equipment. For 6 years, that ambiguity worked entirely in Taylor Energy's favor. Without a confirmed source, there was no clear party to hold accountable, and without accountability, there was little public pressure to investigate further. Then, in 2010, everything changed, not because of anything happening at the Saratoga site itself, but because of an entirely different disaster happening nearby. That April, the Deepwater Horizon rig exploded roughly 40 miles away, triggering the largest accidental marine oil spill in history and pulling an army of scientists, satellites, and cleanup crews into the Gulf to track every drop of oil they could find. In the process of mapping that catastrophe, responders noticed something strange. A second, unrelated slick, one that had nothing to do with the Deepwater Horizon well at all, persistently reappearing near a location where records showed no active platform had operated in years. Investigators traced it back to the buried remains of the Saratoga. The realization was almost unbelievable. A platform destroyed 6 years earlier had been leaking, quietly and continuously, the entire time, hidden not by any deliberate cover-up, but simply by the fact that nobody was looking for a disaster nobody knew still existed. The explanation, once experts pieced it together, turned out to be a problem of pure physics rather than negligence. The wells were sitting under roughly 150 feet of dense, unstable sediment at a depth where the immense pressure of the trapped oil reservoir was constantly searching for the path of least resistance to the surface. Digging down to physically access and permanently seal them meant potentially destabilizing the very mud that was, in a strange way, partially containing the leak already. Moved too aggressively, and engineers risked turning a slow, chronic seep into a sudden, catastrophic blowout. It was a problem where doing nothing and doing something both carried genuine risk, and for years nobody could agree on which risk was worse. To put the scale of this leak in perspective, environmental researchers eventually estimated that by 2015, the site may have released as much as 1.4 million gallons of oil into the Gulf, enough to rank it among the 10 largest spills the region had ever recorded, decades after the platform that caused it had technically stopped existing. It never produced the dramatic imagery of a burning rig or an oil-soaked coastline overnight, the way the Deepwater Horizon disaster did just a few years later. Instead, it accumulated its damage the way a slow leak in a roof accumulates water damage in a ceiling, invisible for years until the scale becomes impossible to ignore. While the mystery of the slick's origin was being solved, an entirely different kind of story was unfolding around Taylor Energy itself. In 2008, 4 years after the collapse, the company sold the vast majority of its oil and gas assets to a joint venture between the Korea National Oil Corporation and Samsung C&T, walking away with a massive payout. But the leaking wells at the Saratoga site were deliberately excluded from that sale, left behind as Taylor Energy's own legal responsibility. The company set aside a trust fund, reported at the time to be worth $666 million, specifically to cover the eventual cost of dealing with the site. Then, having sold off nearly everything else, Taylor Energy simply kept existing on paper. By 2015, the once major Gulf operator had shrunk down to a single employee, managing what had become the longest-running oil spill in American history almost by default. Imagine being that one remaining employee, representing a company that had once been among the largest privately owned oil operators in the country, now responsible for a slow-motion disaster that regulators, environmental groups, and journalists were only beginning to fully understand. For a company that had quietly hoped the problem would simply fade into bureaucratic paperwork, the growing public attention was the last thing it wanted. Patrick Taylor, the company's founder, had died in 2004, just weeks before Hurricane Ivan struck, and it was his widow, Phyllis Taylor, who inherited both the company and its slowly emerging crisis, reportedly becoming the wealthiest woman in Louisiana, even as the platform she now bore responsibility for sat, leaking, unseen, at the bottom of the Gulf. That attention arrived in force in October 2018, when a Washington Post investigation exposed just how little enforcement action had been taken over more than a decade of leaking. One day after that story broke, the United States Coast Guard issued a formal order demanding Taylor Energy contain the spill immediately or face fines of $40,000 a day. Rather than complying quietly, Taylor Energy pushed back hard, filing lawsuits against the federal government itself, arguing that further containment work was unnecessary and could cost the company as much as $1 billion. In an unusual twist, the company also sued its own newly assigned contractor, the Cuvillian Group, the very firm the Coast Guard had selected to design and build a solution, claiming it lacked the experience to handle a site this complicated. The dispute dragged through federal courtrooms for years while the leak continued beneath the waves. Independent researchers, unconvinced by Taylor Energy's own estimates, conducted new studies suggesting the spill was dramatically larger than anyone had previously calculated, in the range of 10,500 to 29,000 gallons of oil per day, a figure 5 to 13 times higher than earlier government estimates. Court filings from this period read almost like a business dispute rather than an environmental catastrophe, full of arguments over methodology, competing engineering assessments, and accusations that each side was exaggerating or downplaying the numbers to suit its own position. Meanwhile, the oil kept rising to the surface every single day, indifferent to whichever legal argument happened to be winning in court that week. Environmental groups pointed out that if left completely uncontained, the reservoir feeding this leak held enough oil, in theory, to keep seeping into the Gulf for the better part of a century. Despite Taylor Energy's resistance, the Cuvillian Group moved forward with an engineered containment system carefully designed to capture rising oil before it could reach the surface, without disturbing the unstable sediment burying the wells below. It was, in its own way, a remarkable piece of underwater engineering, not an attempt to stop the source at the seabed, but a way to intercept the problem partway through its journey upward, catching oil in a controlled structure and pumping it safely to a collection vessel above. By 2019, that system was operational, marking the first real progress in containing a spill that had already been running silently for 15 years. The system worked something like an upside-down funnel positioned above the buried wellheads, gathering the rising plumes of oil and gas before they could disperse into open water, then channeling the collected fluid through pipes up to a surface vessel where it could be separated, stored, and safely disposed of. It wasn't a fix in the traditional sense. The wells themselves remained buried, unsealed, and technically still leaking. What the containment system actually did was intercept the consequences of that leak before they could spread across the surface of the Gulf, buying time and reducing environmental damage without solving the underlying problem at all. Legally, the fight over responsibility didn't fully resolve until 2021, when Taylor Energy reached a settlement with the federal government. Under the terms of that agreement, the company dropped its lawsuits, agreed to pay hundreds of millions of dollars into a trust to fund permanent well capping and site decontamination, and committed to liquidating its remaining assets to cover civil penalties and environmental damages. It was, on paper, an ending. In practice, it was closer to a formal acknowledgement that a problem this deep, buried under this much mud, might never truly be solved in any traditional sense. There's a particular kind of disaster that doesn't look like a disaster at first, and this is exactly that kind. No fireball, no capsized rig on the evening news, no immediate death toll to grab a headline. Just a slow, patient stream of oil finding its way through 150 feet of sediment day after day for over 2 decades, largely unnoticed by everyone except the scientists tracking it and the one employee left responsible for it. It's a strange kind of abandonment, not a company walking away entirely, but a company reduced to its bare legal minimum, existing almost solely to manage a mess it couldn't fully clean up and couldn't legally escape either. As of the site's current containment status, the system installed by Cuvillian Group continues capturing a significant share of the oil still emerging from beneath the Gulf floor, roughly 1,000 gallons a day by recent estimates, a dramatic improvement from the site's worst years, but still far from zero. According to assessments cited by environmental groups and federal regulators, if the reservoir were ever left completely uncontained, it holds enough oil to potentially keep seeping until sometime after the year 2100. Think about what that actually means. A single hurricane, striking on a single night in September 2004, set in motion a chain of consequences that could realistically outlive everyone currently working to contain it, outlive the containment technology itself, and quite possibly outlive the very memory of the platform that started it all. The Saratoga no longer exists in any recognizable form. It's not sitting rusting on the surface where cameras could capture its decline, the way abandoned platforms sometimes do elsewhere in the Gulf. It's buried, invisible, still technically leaking, still technically somebody's legal responsibility, and still, after 20 years, not entirely finished with its story. So was this platform truly abandoned, or was it simply defeated by a problem too deep and too dangerous to fully solve? The honest answer sits somewhere between the two. Taylor Energy didn't walk away in a single dramatic moment. It receded slowly, selling off everything it could, shrinking down to almost nothing, fighting in court for years to avoid spending more than it had to, while the ocean floor quietly kept doing what oil reservoirs under pressure always do, finding a way out. The next time you look out at a calm, empty stretch of ocean, Remember that some of the most consequential disasters in industrial history never show themselves on the surface at all. Some of them just keep leaking quietly for 100 years, waiting for someone to finally notice. There's also a broader lesson buried in the mud alongside the Saratoga's wreckage. Thousands of aging platforms remain scattered across the Gulf of Mexico today, many of them decades old, some already inactive, all of them eventually facing the same question Taylor Energy tried and failed to answer cleanly. Who pays to properly dismantle a structure once the profits stop flowing? And what happens if the company responsible simply runs out of will or money or time before the job is finished? Regulators have since tightened bonding requirements for offshore operators specifically because of cases like this one, but the Saratoga remains the clearest example of what happens when those safeguards arrive too late for the disaster already underway. It's a reminder that the ocean doesn't forget an unfinished job, even when the company responsible for it would very much like the world to.